A 12-year-old girl stood inside the glittering office of a man who believed he owned the city. His wealth towered above the streets of Manhattan, his name carried power, and his laughter was often the final word in every room he entered. On that day, however, his voice rose not with charm, but with scorn. He mocked the girl's clothes, her backpack, her very presence, and then turned his sneer toward her mother, who had spent nearly a decade scrubbing the floors beneath his shoes. He told them that dreams were not meant for people like them, that no matter what they believed, they would never rise higher than a mop and bucket. But in less than a minute, this little girl would reveal something that would bring his laughter crashing to a halt. And it began with just 4 quiet words. "I speak 9 languages." What happened next would leave a room of millionaires stunned, a mother speechless, and an empire of arrogance shaken to its core. What did she say? And how could a child humiliate a man who thought he could never be touched? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But here's where the mystery begins. How did a young girl like Lucia, the daughter of a woman who spent her nights polishing marble floors, ever come to master 9 different languages? This was not a child raised in privilege, with tutors at her disposal, or endless shelves of books in a private library. This was a girl who lived with her mother Carmen, in a cramped apartment, where every dollar mattered and every meal required sacrifice. And yet, in the middle of struggle, something extraordinary was happening. Late at night, while Carmen returned home exhausted from scrubbing offices, Lucia would be found bent over borrowed books, scribbling notes and repeating words in languages her neighbors could not understand. The world she built in her mind stretched far beyond the 4 walls of that apartment. She was not only learning, she was preparing, though neither she nor her mother could have predicted the stage on which her gift would one day be revealed. So why, if Carmen's devotion to her daughter was so strong, was she still working as a cleaner in the very same building where Lucia would eventually make history? What was it about Rick Sullivan's empire that drew Carmen in every night to wipe away the dust of a life that would never be hers? And most importantly, what made Sullivan so confident that he could laugh in the face of a child, belittle her existence, and dismiss her potential, only to be confronted with a truth that would haunt him forever? These are the questions at the heart of this story, and the answers are as humbling as they are unforgettable. Carmen Johnson arrived in New York City with nothing but 2 suitcases and a quiet determination that most people overlooked. She was an immigrant, a woman who carried with her the memory of a childhood marked by hardship, yet also the fire to build something better for her only daughter, Lucia. Day after day, Carmen took whatever work she could find. When she landed a permanent position as a cleaner in one of Manhattan's most prestigious office towers, she accepted it with gratitude, even though it meant long nights, aching hands, and a future that seemed to stretch endlessly in fluorescent lights and polished marble. She never complained, not once. Carmen carried herself with quiet dignity, as though every floor she scrubbed, every trash bin she emptied, was a step toward giving her daughter opportunities she herself had been denied. In her silence there was strength. In her sacrifice, there was love. Lucia grew up in that environment, not surrounded by toys or luxury, but by her mother's unwavering devotion and a restless curiosity that could not be contained. From the time she could form sentences, she asked questions no one in her neighborhood had answers for. Why did people speak differently on the subway? What did the words on the signs in Chinatown mean? At first, Carmen dismissed these as the innocent wonders of a child. But soon, she realized her daughter wasn't just curious. She was gifted. Lucia collected scraps of newspapers from the bins her mother emptied, tracing the words with her fingers, asking what each one meant. She begged to visit the free public library, where the staff quickly learned her face. While other children played outside, Lucia sat for hours in the corners of that library, her nose buried in books about cultures, dictionaries, and grammar guides in languages most adults had never even heard spoken aloud. And though Carmen worried she could not afford to give her daughter everything, she gave her what mattered most: encouragement and the belief that no dream was too large, On the other end of this story was Rick Sullivan, a man who in many ways embodied the very image of success the city admired, and the very arrogance it despised. He was ruthless in business, known for cutting deals that left others ruined while he basked in profits. Sullivan adored power and he flaunted it. His penthouse parties filled with chandeliers and champagne, his sports cars parked outside in defiance of traffic rules, his expensive suits tailored not just to fit but to announce. People either wanted to be him or feared him, and Sullivan thrived on that division. To him, people like Carmen Johnson were invisible. They were the background to his empire, the silent workforce scrubbing away fingerprints on his glass doors. He never imagined they had stories, or dreams, or children who might one day stand in his office with a gift so rare it could silence a man like him. For years, Carmen scrubbed Sullivan's empire, his conference rooms, his hallways, the executive floors where decisions worth millions were made. Every night she labored under the belief that her sacrifices might someday open doors for Lucia. What she could never have known was that the very building she cleaned, the very empire she polished into gleaming perfection, would one day become the stage for her daughter's quiet rebellion. Because there would come a moment, a single unforgettable moment, when Lucia Johnson would challenge the man who believed he was untouchable. And win. It was late one evening when Carmen Johnson had no choice but to bring her daughter Lucia with her to work. The rent was due, overtime was offered, and leaving her daughter alone in their apartment was not an option. Lucia, now 12 years old, carried her worn-out backpack across the glittering lobby of Sullivan Tower, a building so polished it seemed to reflect the very arrogance of the man who owned it. She waited quietly as her mother gathered supplies, her small frame dwarfed by the marble columns and the golden elevators that carried powerful men and women to the top floors. To everyone else in that building, she was invisible, just another child of the staff. But that night, invisibility would not last long. Rick Sullivan was still in his office. The millionaire rarely slept, preferring late hours where he could review contracts and crush competitors while the city outside finally grew quiet. When his eyes fell upon the girl standing near her mother's cleaning cart, he did not see a child with dreams. He saw an interruption, a distraction, something out of place in the sanctity of his empire. He rose from behind his oak desk, his voice sharp as glass, and asked Carmen why she had brought her daughter into a space meant only for business. His words dripped with mockery. Then his gaze turned toward the girl's backpack, patched at the edges, the fabric worn thin from years of use. He laughed, not kindly, not playfully, but with the cruelty of a man who had never known hunger or want. "That's all you've got? A ragged bag and a mop to look forward to? She'll end up just like you," he said, jabbing his finger toward Carmen as though her entire life's labor was nothing more than a punchline. For a moment, silence filled the office. Carmen lowered her eyes, too weary to argue, too used to swallowing insults for the sake of survival. But beside her, Lucia did not bow her head. The girl straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stared directly at the man who thought he was untouchable. She did not cry. She did not waver. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, calm, and far older than her years. "I speak 9 languages," she said. The words cut through the room like a blade. For the first time, Rick Sullivan's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth as if to dismiss her claim with laughter, but the laughter never came, because there was something in her tone, something undeniable, that made even him pause. And in that instant, the game changed. The moment Lucia's quiet words left her lips, the entire balance of that room shifted. For a man like Rick Sullivan, whose empire was built on dominance, there was no greater threat than a challenge to his authority. He could not simply let those words stand. To admit them without question would mean allowing a poor cleaner's daughter to command respect in a space he believed belonged only to him. So he did what men like Sullivan always did when faced with the unexpected. He laughed. The sound was harsh, echoing across the marble walls of his office, meant to drown out the weight of what he had just heard. 9 languages, he sneered. "Do you take me for a fool? His eyes flicked to Carmen, then back to Lucia. She's just a girl. And like her mother, she'll be nothing more than a cleaner. But beneath the surface of his laughter, something restless stirred, an unease he tried to bury. Determined to crush the girl's defiance, Sullivan summoned several of his top executives into the room. These were men and women who had built their careers under his shadow, individuals who knew better than to question his authority. They filed in quickly, curiosity flickering in their eyes as they noticed the janitor's daughter standing beside the cleaning cart. Sullivan gestured toward Lucia with a mocking smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, our young guest here claims she can speak 9 languages. Imagine that. A prodigy from the slums." The executives chuckled politely, though some glanced at the girl with a trace of unease. Carmen shifted nervously, clutching her mop handle, torn between protecting her daughter and letting her stand her ground. But Lucia remained steady, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze unflinching. The air in that room grew heavier with every passing second. The stakes were clear. If Lucia faltered, if she stammered or failed to prove her claim, it would confirm every insult Sullivan had hurled at her and her mother. She would be reduced to a child who dared to dream beyond her place, and Sullivan's laughter would carry the day. But if she succeeded, if she truly demonstrated mastery of the languages she claimed, the humiliation would not belong to her. It would belong to him. And that was something Sullivan could not afford. The question lingered in everyone's mind, even the viewers of this story. How could the daughter of a cleaner, raised in poverty, truly master 9 languages? What resources could she possibly have had? What drove her to learn when her world was marked by hardship and limitation? Doubt filled the room, and yet beneath it was something else. Curiosity. Sullivan leaned back in his chair, his smile sharpening into a blade. "Very well," he said at last, his voice carrying the weight of challenge. "If you truly are what you claim, then prove it. Not with words plucked from a library book, not with memorized phrases, but with this." From a shelf behind his desk, he pulled out an ancient leather-bound manuscript, its pages yellowed with age and covered in script most of his executives could not recognize. The room stilled as he placed it on the desk, pushing it toward the girl. "Translate this," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Read it, and show us if your claim has any merit at all." And in that moment, every breath in the room seemed to vanish. Executives leaned forward. Carmen's heart raced. Sullivan folded his arms with the confidence of a man who believed he had set a trap no child could escape. But as Lucia stepped forward, her small hands reaching for the worn pages, the story was no longer about arrogance or status. It was about truth. And the truth was about to silence the room. The room was silent as Lucia Johnson pulled the manuscript closer, the leather cover rough beneath her small hands. The executives shifted in their seats, some exchanging doubtful glances, others smirking in anticipation of the girl's failure. Rick Sullivan leaned back, arms crossed, the faintest trace of a smirk curling at the edge of his lips. He was certain this would end the way all challenges against him ended, with his dominance intact and his opponent humiliated. But what followed was a moment that none of them, not even Sullivan, would ever forget. Lucia turned to the first page, her lips moving carefully at first, and then with growing confidence. The words rolled from her tongue not as guesses or broken fragments, but as fluent, precise recitations of classical Latin, the language of scholars and ancient texts. Her voice was steady, melodic, carrying words that most in the room could not even recognize, let alone understand. The executives froze. Some leaned forward instinctively, their disbelief evident. One of them whispered to another, She's actually reading it." Sullivan's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing, trying to catch her in a mistake. But the girl gave him none. She moved fluidly across the page, her voice filling the office with the echoes of a language long forgotten by all but the most educated. And then, without warning, she stopped. The pause was deliberate. When she spoke again, The words were no longer Latin. They were Arabic, fluent, precise, elegant. The cadence of her speech shifted, her tongue moving with the ease of someone who had lived with the language her entire life. Executives exchanged glances, their skepticism unraveling into awe. Rick Sullivan's fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, a nervous tick betraying the unease now crawling under his skin. He tried to laugh, a shallow sound meant to cut through the rising tension, but his laughter cracked in the middle, betraying the fear he refused to show. Still, Lucia did not stop. From Arabic, she moved to Mandarin, her voice calm, measured, confident. She traced the words in front of her and spoke them as though they had been written just for her. The rhythm was flawless, the tones precise, leaving even the most cynical among the executives struggling to comprehend what they were witnessing. And then, as if to seal the moment beyond doubt, she shifted once more, this time into Hebrew. The room's silence deepened. No one laughed now. No one whispered. Even Carmen, standing frozen near the cleaning cart, could barely breathe. Her daughter's voice carried through the air, a symphony of languages spoken with grace and mastery, each one more unexpected than the last. What began as doubt in the minds of those gathered had transformed into awe. The janitor's daughter had just crossed a threshold that none of them could deny. Rick Sullivan's face flushed, his jaw tightening as the weight of what was unfolding pressed against him. The arrogance that had carried him through every confrontation now began to crack, piece by piece. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his confidence eroding in plain view of his subordinates. This was not the spectacle he had envisioned. It was not humiliation for the girl. It was humiliation for him. For the first time in years, the skyscraper king found himself powerless. The truth becomes clear. This was the moment Rick Sullivan was dethroned. Not by wealth, not by power, not by influence or intimidation, but by the brilliance of a child. Rick Sullivan could not sit quietly and watch his empire of arrogance collapse. The sound of Lucia Johnson's voice still echoed in the corners of his office, the ancient words falling from her lips with such mastery that even his most loyal executives dared not laugh. For a man who thrived on domination, silence was unbearable. He leaned forward, his smile stretched thin, desperate to regain control of a room that no longer belonged to him. Languages, he scoffed, are nothing more than tricks of memory. Parlor games for the gifted, but intelligence? True intelligence? His gaze hardened, sweeping the faces of his subordinates before landing back on the girl. That is inherited. That is bred into families who belong in these towers. Not born in slums, not carried in the blood of cleaners. His words struck like venom, intended to wound, to remind everyone present that no matter how extraordinary this moment seemed, he was still the one seated in the leather chair, still the man with the penthouse view of the city. He wanted them to remember he was untouchable, but Lucia Johnson did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes, nor did she waver beneath the weight of his scorn. Instead, she placed her hand back on the manuscript, turned another page, and read a line aloud in flawless Greek, her voice steady and unshaken. Then she looked directly at Sullivan, her expression calm, unyielding, her words cutting through the suffocating tension with quiet precision. Then why can't you read this? The sentence was simple, but its impact shattered the room. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The executives froze, their eyes darting between the girl and the man they had once feared. Sullivan's face stiffened, his mouth half open, yet no sound emerged. The question hung in the air like a blade pressed against his pride, leaving him powerless to answer. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult. His trademark laughter, the weapon he used to mock and belittle, never came. It died on his lips, strangled by the reality that no amount of money or arrogance could shield him from the truth now laid bare before his own employees. One by one, the executives looked away, unable to meet his eyes. For years, they had echoed his mockery, nodded at his arrogance, and accepted his dominance as law. But in that instant his authority felt fragile, hollow, exposed. It was not the silence of respect that filled the room. It was the silence of humiliation. Carmen Johnson stood near the cleaning cart, her hands trembling, her chest rising and falling as though she had forgotten how to breathe. She had carried the weight of humiliation for years, had bent her back beneath floors Sullivan would never touch, had endured insult after insult for the sake of survival. And now, in one breathtaking moment, her daughter had done what she never could. She had destroyed the man who mocked them with nothing more than truth. Carmen held back tears, pride swelling inside her in a way that words could never fully express. She saw in her daughter's calm defiance not only victory, but also vindication. The proof that sacrifice was never wasted, that dignity could rise from the humblest of places. The reflection becomes clear. In that Manhattan skyscraper, the balance of power shifted forever. A man who believed wealth was invincibility was humbled by a girl with nothing but brilliance. And the silence that filled his office that night was not his weapon anymore. It was hers. This story was never only about Lucia Johnson and Rick Sullivan. It was not confined to the gleaming windows of a Manhattan skyscraper. Nor was it merely the clash between a child and a millionaire. It was about every underestimated soul who has ever been told they do not belong. It was about every mother like Carmen Johnson, who scrubbed floors in silence, carrying the invisible burden of sacrifice so her child could one day reach higher. It was about the countless immigrant families in America who arrive with nothing but hope, who work through aching nights, who endure the sting of being overlooked, dismissed, and told to stay in their place. And yet, through sheer determination, through education, and through the power of resilience, they rise. They rise not with privilege but with grit, not with connections, but with unshakable will. Carmen Johnson's story was the echo of thousands of women who gave everything so that their children might have more, even if the world never applauded their efforts. Lucia Johnson became more than just a girl who spoke 9 languages. She became a symbol. She reminded us that brilliance is not locked behind gated communities or inherited wealth. It is born in libraries, in late nights with borrowed books, in whispered encouragements from mothers who refuse to let their children believe they are less than anyone else. Her moment in Sullivan's office was not simply a child humiliating a man. It was a turning point, a crack in the illusion of untouchable power, proof that knowledge and courage could strip away arrogance like paper. To those executives in the room, it was unforgettable. To her mother, it was redemption. And to everyone watching this story unfold now, it is a reminder that dignity cannot be bought or destroyed, no matter how many times it is trampled. For every viewer who has struggled, who has felt dismissed, who has carried the weight of sacrifice without recognition, this story speaks directly to you. It says that worth is not determined by the voices that mock you, but by the quiet strength that endures. It says that women, especially mothers, possess a strength that reshapes generations. Carmen Johnson's tears that night were not only for the victory her daughter won, but for the millions of silent victories mothers across this country win every day. Victories that rarely make headlines, but change the course of lives. And so, what happened in that office was bigger than one confrontation. It was a reflection of America itself, the immigrant dream, the relentless pursuit of education, the strength of women who refuse to be broken, and the humbling of those who mistake wealth for wisdom. Rick Sullivan walked into that room believing he was untouchable. He walked out knowing that even the smallest voice, if spoken with truth and courage, can shake the foundations of an empire. And in that truth, we find not just a story to tell, but a lesson to carry. And now, we turn to you. The story of Lucia Johnson, Carmen Johnson, and Rick Sullivan leaves us with questions that echo far beyond the walls of that Manhattan skyscraper. Do you believe talent is inherited, or is it earned through the tireless nights of study, through the sacrifices of parents, through the fire of resilience that no money can buy? What would you have done if you were in that room, standing beside Lucia, watching her calmly dismantle the arrogance of a man who thought he could never be touched? Would you have held your breath? Would you have cheered, or would you have doubted until the very last moment? And what of Rick Sullivan? Do you believe that he truly learned his lesson? Or did his pride simply fracture in silence, leaving him to rebuild the image of power he once carried so easily? These are questions that only you can answer. And they are questions that matter because they speak to who we are as people, as families, as communities. Stories like these do not just live in books or headlines. They live in us, in the choices we make and the ways we lift one another up. So we ask you, what does this story mean to you? Do you see yourself in Carmen's quiet strength, in Lucia's defiance, or even in Rick Sullivan's humbling? Share your thoughts below, because your voice in this conversation matters. And if this story struck something deep within you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The story of Lucia Johnson and her mother Carmen Johnson is more than a tale of a child outsmarting a millionaire. It is a testament to intelligence, dignity, and resilience. It reminds us that brilliance can come from the humblest places, and that no empire of steel and glass is stronger than the will of a determined heart. Rick Sullivan believed that power could only be measured in money, in status, in titles carved onto office doors. But that day, in the height of his empire, he was taught that power can just as easily belong to a young girl with a worn-out backpack and the courage to raise her head high. Because sometimes power doesn't live in skyscrapers or bank accounts. Sometimes it walks quietly in with a backpack and speaks 9 languages. And when it does, it has the ability to shatter arrogance, rewrite expectations, and remind the world that human potential is limitless. Carmen Johnson, who once scrubbed Sullivan's marble floors, stood in silent awe as her daughter's brilliance rewrote the narrative of their lives. That moment was not just a victory for a child, it was a victory for every mother who has ever sacrificed, for every immigrant who has ever been dismissed, and for every person who has ever been underestimated. And so, this story lingers with us because it is not confined to the past. It echoes in today's classrooms, in late-night study sessions, in mothers returning home from long shifts, in daughters daring to dream bigger than the world tells them they should. Lucia Johnson's courage lives on as a reminder that the walls of arrogance can crumble, not with violence, but with wisdom. And perhaps, somewhere in another towering building tonight, another Carmen and another Lucia are living their own chapter of defiance, ready to prove the world wrong. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Let them hear about Carmen's sacrifice, Lucia's courage, and the moment Rick Sullivan's empire shook under the weight of truth. And don't forget to subscribe, because next week we're bringing you another story that will leave you speechless, one that will challenge everything you thought you knew, and remind you once again of the strength that lives in ordinary people who refuse to be silenced.